when the Galactic Concordance, a vast, ancient, and self-proclaimed enlightened collective of species, finally reached the relatively obscure spiral arm containing Sol. They did so with a sense of weary obligation rather than eager exploration. Their drones had detected primitive FTL signatures, crude energy weapon discharges, and planetary pollution levels that made even the most jaded xenobiologist wince. Standard procedure for encountering a Type 0 civilization, barely spacefaring, prone to internal conflict, and blissfully unaware of the cosmic neighborhood, was simple. Observe from a distance, catalog, and if they didn't wipe themselves out first, eventually make first contact under strictly controlled conditions to guide their burgeoning steps towards galactic civility. The Concordance had dealt with countless nascent species over millennia. Some were warlike, some fearful, some surprisingly insightful despite their limitations. None, however, had ever inspired the particular blend of bewildered frustration and sheer, unadulterated panic that humanity would soon cultivate like a rare, weaponized fungus. Their initial observations were uninspiring. The dominant species on the third planet, designation Sol, 3, called themselves humans. They were physically unimpressive, soft-skinned bipeds with bizarrely varied pigmentation and hair, fragile bone structures, and an alarming lack of natural weaponry or armor. Their technology, while having achieved rudimentary spaceflight, was a chaotic patchwork. Fusion drives hummed alongside internal combustion engines. Sleek digital interfaces were contrasted with clunky analog dials, and their primary method of communication across vast distances still involved bouncing radio waves off satellites they themselves had put there. It was frankly a mess. The Concordance surveillance ships, sleek, silent vessels cloaked by technology that bent spacetime itself, settled into orbit, their sophisticated sensors patiently cataloging the chaotic energy signatures and illogical behavior patterns emanating from the blue-green marble below. They observed conflicts over abstract concepts like borders and resources on a single planet, a concept so mind-bogglingly primitive to a species that had access to entire Xingxi star systems that was logged as a critical anomaly. They noted the bizarre rituals involving fermented plant matter and loud noises that seemed to serve no biological purpose. They documented the art, the music, the philosophy, chaotic, often contradictory, and frequently baffling. The initial assessment, filed by the lead xenosociologist, a venerable being of pure energy named Xyler, was dismissive. Sol, 3 presents a typical Type 0 civilization exhibiting severe auto-regulative deficiencies and a concerning propensity for intraspecies aggression. Their technological development is asynchronous and lacks centralized control. Recommend continued passive observation until either self-extinction or the development of a cohesive global government capable of rational discourse. This report was filed, stamped, and largely forgotten amidst the Concordance's far more pressing concerns, such as mediating trade disputes between the crystalline xylos and the gaseous nebulans, or cataloging the psychic resonance patterns of the newly discovered sentient fungal forests of Mycelia Prime. Humanity was at best a footnote. Then, the pirates arrived. Not Concordance-affiliated entities, of course. The Concordance had long ago integrated or dissolved any organized crime on a galactic scale. These were fringe operators, opportunistic raiders from the lawless edges of the galaxy, drawn by the faint energy signatures of a developing space civilization that hadn't yet figured out how to protect itself. The Kthar, as they called themselves, were reptilian humanoids, cruel, avaricious, and heavily armed. They ran protection rackets on less advanced species and snatched anything of value. A Type 0 world, especially one broadcasting such chaotic energy, looked like a ripe plum ready for shaking. The first Cthar scout ship, the Serpent's Tooth, shimmered out of FDL at the edge of the Sol system, its sensors eagerly scanning for easy targets. It detected the human presence, a few scattered research stations, some orbital infrastructure, and a nascent mining operation on a nearby asteroid. Primitive, just as expected. The scout transmitted its findings back to the main Cthar fleet, waiting patiently in the void beyond the system's heliosphere. The message was simple: prey located, soft, unprepared, proceeding to initial harvest. The Concordance surveillance ships, observing from their hidden perches, noted the arrival of the Cthar with mild interest. This was unfortunate for the humans, but not entirely unexpected. Incursions by such groups were rare within Concordant space, but the Sol system was technically unclaimed territory. They would continue to observe, documenting the humans' response to external aggression. It would be valuable data on their capacity for unified action under duress, or more likely, their complete collapse. The Cthar fleet arrived a few local days later, a jagged, brutal collection of cruisers, frigates, and transports, looking like a swarm of angry metallic insects against the inky black. They made no attempt at stealth. Their energy signatures flared defiantly. Their comms channels crackled with arrogant boasts translated by the Concordance observers. They intended to make an example of these primitives, to strip their orbital assets, perhaps seize a few 100,000 specimens for the slave markets, and move on. They broadcast a standard ultimatum on all known frequencies, a harsh, guttural series of clicks and hisses that the Concordance translators rendered as, to the dominant species of Sol 3. We are the Cthar. Surrender all space-based assets and provide tribute in the form of technology and biological specimens, or face immediate and total annihilation. The Concordance observers waited for the inevitable human response. Panicked, disjointed calls for help, perhaps some futile, uncoordinated resistance. What they received instead was silence. For a full local hour, nothing. The Cthar comms crackled with impatience. The Concordance observers exchanged bewildered data packets. Had the humans already destroyed their communication infrastructure in their panic? Then a single clear signal cut through the static. It wasn't on any of the frequencies the Cthar had used for their ultimatum. It was on a channel previously used only for civilian air traffic control within Sol 3's atmosphere. The signal was simple, stark, and broadcast on a tight beam, directional pulse aimed directly at the lead Cthar cruiser. The Concordance observers rerouted the signal, translating it with their sophisticated linguistic processors. The Cthar, who hadn't bothered with such nuances, simply registered it as an incoming transmission. The human response was not a plea. It was not a surrender. It was, the Concordance translators noted with a growing sense of profound unease, a recording. A piece of human music, specifically a raucous, energetic composition featuring loud drums, distorted stringed instruments, and a human voice shouting in a pattern that seemed both aggressive and celebratory. The Concordance translators helpfully provided a lyrical analysis, though it only deepened the mystery. Something about not taking it, about standing up, and a surprising number of references to bodily functions and mythological creatures. The Cthar commander, a hulking brute named Krogar, felt a spike of irritation. Primitives daring to respond with noise? He ordered the fleet to begin its advance, targeting the largest human orbital station. Teach them the cost of defiance, he snarled into his comms. But as his fleet began to move, the humans broadcast another signal. This time, it wasn't music. It was a message in heavily accented but understandable galactic basic, the lingua franca of the Concordance, and by extension, most rating species. It was delivered in a calm, almost conversational tone by a human voice that sounded remarkably cheerful. Uh, hey there, scale boys, the voice began. So, yeah, we got your little message. Surrender or annihilate. Got it. See, here's the thing. We've had a bit of a rough century down here. Lot of internal arguments, a few close calls with self-deletion, general planetary chaos. You know how it is. Builds character. Also, paranoia. Lots and lots of paranoia. Krogar's mandibles clicked in annoyance. Was this a delay tactic? A desperate attempt at negotiation? The human voice continued, still cheerful. And when you've spent 100 years arguing about who gets the last slice of pizza, building bunkers under your bunkers, and generally assuming the worst about everyone, including yourselves, well, you tend to develop a few contingencies. For, bad days, or scaled aliens showing up uninvited. A faint hum registered on the concordant sensors, emanating from within the asteroid belt that girdled the Sol system. The Cthar sensors registered it too, but dismissed it as background radiation from the loosely packed rock and ice. So, while we appreciate you dropping by, the human voice said, the cheerfulness now carrying a distinct, unsettling edge, we're going to have to decline your offer and politely request that you leave. Immediately, Krogar actually laughed, a dry, rasping sound. You refuse? Primitives, your defiance is noted. Annihilation it is. Yeah, about that, the human voice said. The humming from the asteroid belt intensified, subtly, almost imperceptibly. See, the thing about humans? We're real good at taking things that weren't meant to be weapons and making them spectacularly deadly. Like, say, mining equipment, or, rocks. Panic alarms suddenly blared on the lead Cthar cruiser. Krogar's tactical display, moments before showing a clear path to the human station, was suddenly a swarm of red warnings. When the Cthar fleet advanced into the Sol asteroid belt, expecting to simply brush aside some primitive mining drones, they found themselves entering a kill zone crafted with a level of malicious ingenuity that transcended mere tactics. The rocks weren't just rocks anymore. The humans, over decades of paranoid preparation during their internal squabbles, have been hollowing out asteroids, installing drives, guidance systems, and terrifyingly powerful kinetic weaponry cobbled together from mining lasers and mass drivers. They weren't just static obstacles. They were automated, heavily armed, disguised warships, bristling with enough firepower to punch through Cthar cruiser plating. Welcome to the Sol System Demilitarized Zone, the human voice announced over the open channel, the cheerfulness now replaced by a chillingly calm, almost bored tone. Please observe all posted signage. Casualties incurred due to failure to comply are not the responsibility of the Sol System Defense Militia. The asteroid field erupted. What the Cthar had seen as inert obstacles became a maelstrom of directed kinetic energy and repurposed mining lasers firing with pinpoint accuracy. The sheer density of fire was unlike anything the Cthar, used to facing organized fleets in open space, had ever encountered. Asteroids the size of small moons, hollowed out and reinforced, slammed into Cthar cruisers with the force of relativistic kilotons. Smaller rocks, guided by frantic, human-programmed AI, swarmed frigates and transports, tearing through their hulls with concentrated laser fire. Krogar watched in horror as his fleet, his perfectly synchronized fleet, devolved into burning wreckage. Their advanced sensors, calibrated to detect traditional warships, were useless against these disguised, unconventional threats. Their centralized command structure, so effective against predictable enemies, faltered against an enemy that fought not as a single entity, but as a decentralized, unpredictable swarm. They're using mining equipment as weapons, A frantic voice shrieked over the Kthar comms. No, Krogar whispered, the realization chilling him to his reptilian core. They're using everything. The humans weren't just fighting with repurposed tools. They were fighting with a ferocity, a cunning, and a sheer, bloody-minded refusal to die that the Kthar had never witnessed. Human pilots in tiny, ridiculously fast interceptors, originally designed for asteroid navigation, darted between Kthar ships, launching guided missiles jury-rigged from survey rockets. Human engineers, trapped on orbital stations under fire, were reportedly using salvaged debris and plasma torches to build improvised defenses and even counterweaponry while being shot at. The Kthar had superiority in numbers, in technology, in centralized command, and in tactical doctrine. The humans had the home field advantage, several decades of stockpiled paranoia, and a deeply ingrained cultural inability to accept being told what to do by anyone, let alone giant space lizards. When the dust settled and the burning wreckage of the Kthar fleet drifted through the newly renamed Kthar Memorial Asteroid Field, the Concordance observers were left in stunned silence. Xyler, the energy being refiled his report. The assessment was updated. Previous assessment of Sol 3 civilization requires significant revision. Designation Type 0 may be insufficient. Recommend immediate reevaluation of human threat potential. Further observation is required, preferably from a significantly greater distance and with enhanced existential hazard protocols activated. Note, recommend dispatching a cultural liaison immediately with a focus on understanding the concepts of spite, duct tape, and holding a grudge. We may have made a mistake. And when the Concordance decided to open communication channels with the newly recognized, unexpectedly terrifying Sol System Defense Militia, hoping to establish diplomatic ties and perhaps understand how primitives could dismantle a major raiding fleet with rocks and lasers, they received another transmission. It was the same cheerful human voice as before. Hey, Concordance folks. Yeah, we know you've been watching. Bit creepy, honestly. Anyway, just wanted to let you know that whole Kthar thing, that was just us warming up. Also, we found a bunch of their ships mostly intact. Turns out their tech isn't so tough once you start hitting it with a hammer and yelling. We'll figure it out. So, you guys on a trade? We're good at making things explode, and we hear you have actual FDL highways. Could be fun. The Concordance paused. Trade? With these humans? When the galaxy thought it had seen everything, humanity arrived. And that's when things got interesting. Part 2. When the Concordance fully processed the implications of the Kthar incident, the sheer audacity, the technical improvisation, the unsettling cheerfulness in the face of galactic-scale violence, they realized they had a situation that defied every established protocol. Humans weren't just a Type 0 civilization. They were a variable, a glitch in the cosmic code. Diplomatic overtures were decided upon, cautiously. A delegation, led by the unflappable Ambassador Drell of the Harmonious Choirs, a species known for their soothing psychic presence and inability to lie, was dispatched to Sol with a clear mandate: establish communication, assess threat level, and try to understand what made humans tick. Ambassador Drell's first transmission back to the Concordance Central Council was challenging to parse. Initial contact established. Humans are complex. Their primary form of address appears to involve shortening designations and utilizing sounds associated with mild surprise or confusion. Example: Ambassador Drell is frequently rendered as Ambassador J or J-Man, requesting clarification on appropriate non-standard nomenclature protocols. Subsequent transmissions did little to clear the confusion. Drell reported on human diplomatic practices, which seemed to involve copious amounts of a dark, bitter liquid they called coffee, frequent seemingly random bursts of humor that often involved self-deprecation or mild insults towards their own species, and an alarming tendency to conduct serious negotiations while wearing clothing depicting mythological creatures or advertising various forms of nutrient paste. They refer to their defense strategy as the Porcupine Protocol. Drell transmitted psychic frustration leaking into his normally serene reports. Apparently, it involves making themselves appear simultaneously harmless and unexpectedly painful to engage with. This aligns with their demonstrated capabilities. The Concordance Council, ancient beings who had guided empires and pacified entire sectors, found themselves utterly flummoxed. Humans didn't fit the models. Warlike species were predictable. Identify power structures, assess military strength, apply calibrated pressure. Fearful species were manageable. Offer protection in exchange for resources or integration. Even the truly bizarre, like the sentient gas clouds, eventually adhered to some form of logical interaction. But humans? Their logic seemed to run on a different operating system entirely, one powered by spite, caffeine, and an almost pathological need to prove everyone else wrong. When the Concordance offered advanced medical technology, expecting gratitude and compliance, the humans accepted it, reverse engineered it within weeks, and then started asking if the energy transfer protocols could be repurposed to make better toasters. When the Concordance offered access to their vast historical archives, detailing the rise and fall of galactic civilizations, the humans mostly seemed interested in the parts about ancient alien empires collapsing due to internal bureaucracy, finding it relatable. The real turning point, the moment the Concordance truly grasped the depth of their misunderstanding, came not through diplomacy, but through a galactic crisis. The GHRUL, a ravenous hive mind species that consumed everything in its path, emerged from the void between galaxies, a tide of chitin and hunger. They were an existential threat, a force of nature. The Concordance fleets, vast and powerful as they were built for strategic engagements and containment, not for the relentless, overwhelming tide of the GHRUL. Losses mounted. Panic began to spread. When the call for aid went out across the galaxy, a desperate plea for any species, no matter how minor, to contribute what they could, the Concordance expected token support from their member races. A few ships here, some logistical support there. They certainly didn't expect much from Sol 3, the porcupine world with its bizarre inhabitants. What they got was the human response. It didn't come in the form of sleek, powerful warships. It came in the form of what the humans cheerfully called the scrap fleet. A motley collection of vessels that looked like they were cobbled together in a junkyard. Freighters bristling with oversized weaponry. Mining ships refitted with point defense lasers. Even what appeared to be a converted luxury liner with extra engines strapped to the hull and a main cannon that looked suspiciously like a scaled-up industrial plasma cutter. They were uncoordinated, their energy signatures were messy, and their comms channels were a cacophony of human voices shouting, laughing, and playing that same raucous music. But when the scrap fleet hit the GHRUL swarm, something unexpected happened. The GHRUL hive mind was used to predictable prey, species that fought in formation, that retreated when overwhelmed, that had fear patterns it could exploit. The humans didn't do any of that. They charged into the swarm. They used maneuvers that defied all known physics, probably because the ships themselves defied all known engineering principles. They didn't retreat when damaged. They seemed to get angrier, firing off weapons that appeared to have been attached with prayer and industrial adhesives. Their smaller vessels are deliberately colliding with GHRUL ships after critical damage, a Concordance fleet commander reported, aghast. They are weaponizing their own destruction. Affirmative. The human voice from the Scrap Fleet command channel responded cheerfully. We call that turning lemons into slightly less exploding but still pretty useful chitin shrapnel. The GHRUL hive mind, for the first time in its existence, experienced something akin to confusion. Its predictable consumption patterns were disrupted by this chaotic, self-sacrificing energy. Its coordinated attacks faltered against an enemy that didn't adhere to logical targeting priorities. The humans weren't trying to preserve their assets. They were trying to inflict maximum damage by any means necessary. They were creative, they were relentless, and they seemed to view their own mortality as more of a suggestion than a rule. When a section of the GHRUL swarm breached the Concordance lines, heading for a vulnerable civilian transport convoy, the Scrap Fleet didn't hesitate. They threw themselves into the path of the swarm, ships exploding, humans yelling challenges over open comms. A human cruiser, the Pride of Earth, already critically damaged, deliberately rammed a GHRUL bioship twice its size, the resulting explosion carving a temporary, burning hole in the swarm. "We got it!" A human voice cheered over the comms, moments before the signal was lost. "Told you this old tub had one more good hit in her." It wasn't just the reckless bravery. It was the ingenuity. The humans had apparently repurposed agricultural bioagents into a corrosive spray that dissolved GHRUL chitin on contact. They had adapted seismic charges, meant for asteroid mining, into devastating anti-swarm weapons. They were even broadcasting snippets of human stand-up comedy routines on wide-spectrum channels, seemingly just to annoy the hive mind. Ambassador Drell noted in his report that while the humor was still largely incomprehensible, the intent to irritate was crystal clear. When the GHRUL advance finally stalled, broken and confused by an enemy it couldn't comprehend, it wasn't due to the strategic brilliance of the Concordance fleets alone. It was due in no small part to the chaotic, determined, and utterly illogical intervention of the human Scrap Fleet. They hadn't won the war, but they had blunted the tip of the spear, buying the Concordance precious time to regroup and find a weakness in the GHRUL collective. When the war eventually turned, and the GHRUL were pushed back into the void, the humans didn't ask for territory or riches. They asked for salvage rights to the GHRUL wreckage, access to Concordance manufacturing facilities. "We promise we won't build anything too crazy," the human representative said, winking, and a guaranteed supply of coffee beans. The Concordance, battered but safe, agreed. They had learned a profound lesson. They had encountered a species that thrived on chaos, that turned disadvantages into weapons, and that, when faced with the overwhelming horror of the void, just rolled up its sleeves and got to work with a grin and a plasma cutter. When the galaxy looks at humanity now, they no longer see a Type 0 civilization. They see a species that, when faced with impossible odds, doesn't just survive. It makes things interesting. It makes things explode. And it always punches above its weight. And when the next galactic threat emerges from the darkness, the Concordance knows exactly who they'll call. They just have to be prepared for the music, the questionable jokes, and the sheer, terrifying ingenuity that comes with the human response.